While we're super bullish about the use of AI in evaluations in general, I think we internally do think that it's unlikely to replace the role of household surveys. All the analysis, all the design, everything in that pipeline could be replaced by AI at some point, but you still have to go and you have to talk to people.
Welcome to Survey and Beyond, the data collection podcast by SurveyCTO. I'm your host, Marta Costa. Each episode brings you expert tips, tools, and insights to make data collection smarter, safer, and easier. Let's dive in. Welcome, Doug, to the podcast. It is great to have you here with me. To set the stage for our discussion and to kick off, could you introduce yourself to our listeners and also maybe introduce what you do at IDinsight and more specifically your involvement with the Data Delta team at IDinsight?
Yeah, great. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Well, let me start by giving a quick introduction to IDinsight. So IDinsight, we're a global nonprofit. We work in a lot of different countries, and our goal is to help other nonprofits in government agencies make better decisions using data. So our bread and butter service is impact evaluations. We do a lot of randomized control trials, but we do offer a lot of other services as well. We offer customized data science services, do a lot of process evaluations, and do a lot of sort of other evaluations. So that's IDinsight. At IDinsight, I think we've been around for a little over 10 years. We've always done a ton of data collection and a lot of household surveys in particular. And the reason is because with most of the programs we evaluate, the ultimate goal of the program is to affect households. And so if you want to measure whether or not that program is working, you typically have to talk to a lot of households. You have to do a household survey. And so Data Delta was kind of born and bred out of that. Data Delta is IDinsight's internal initiative effort to make household surveys better, faster, cheaper. And as for my own role, so I am a statistician at Data Delta at IDinsight. I kind of focus half of my time on Data Delta and on the sampling stuff that we'll talk about in a little bit. And I spend about half of my time on other IDinsight projects with a focus on impact evaluations of education interventions.
Great introduction. So I wanted to focus, just like you mentioned, on sampling methods. That will be the focus of our conversation today. And you have been doing a lot of research to improve the reliability and the cost effectiveness of survey sampling. So could you tell us what led you to work on this and to look at new approaches to survey sampling?
When you do a household survey, sampling households is one of the biggest challenges. The ideal way to sample households, or the ideal data set for sampling households, would be like a list of every household in the country or area that you want to do this survey. And then with additional information like the phone number and where they live and all this stuff, then it would be simple. You just use Excel, randomly sample households from that list, give them a call, and you're done with your survey. Unless you live in Norway or a couple other countries, there's no single list of households like that you can use for sampling. So basically, the way sampling has traditionally been performed for household surveys, there's sort of two basic approaches. The first is a rigorous but really expensive approach that's typically used for large surveys like the DHS, LSMS, and most surveys conducted by national statistical offices. The basic idea behind this approach, which I will call like conventional two-stage sampling, is you take the census data, you randomly select small areas from the census data. Within those areas, you list all of those households in the sampled areas, and then you subsample households from those lists. This is very rigorous, but the downside is it's very expensive. Like listing all the households in those areas is very time consuming. So there's a set of alternative approaches that are much less expensive, that use sort of pseudo-random methods to select households without doing the listing. These are used by a lot of different research organizations. They're very commonly used by market research firms. But the key question is like whether or not they're rigorous. So the goal of this sort of research initiative within IDinsight, the main goal was like, can we figure out a way to do sampling that's reasonably rigorous, but also pretty inexpensive? And then there was kind of a secondary goal is like, how can we do sampling in cases where we don't have access to census data?
And from my understanding, you explored using a list of voters in India, but you have also been exploring a lot with using satellite imagery too. Could you maybe explain why using this technology could hold such a promise to survey sampling?
Yeah. So there's two great things about satellite imagery. I mentioned the ideal data set from a sampling perspective would be like, just a list of all of the households. So one thing you can do with satellite imagery is you can look down and you can get a sense of like all the rooftops, so which buildings have people living in them. You're almost getting to the point where you're sort of getting towards that ideal data set of a list of all households. You could just look at all the satellite imagery, identify all the buildings, the residential buildings, randomly pick some residential buildings, and then go interview the people in those residential buildings. We're not exactly there yet when it comes to satellite imagery. One of the methods that I'll talk about a little bit later, which we're calling rooftop sampling, kind of uses an approach that builds off of that. The other really big advantage of satellite imagery is that it allows you to estimate, it can serve as a substitute for census data. The traditional approach, the traditional rigorous but expensive approach that I mentioned earlier, requires that you have pretty granular census data to do sampling. And without it, you're kind of stuck. But unfortunately, a lot of countries that we work in, that granular census data does not exist, or is not made publicly available. So for example, in the Philippines, the most granular level of census data that's publicly available is at the barangay level. And barangays can have like 100,000 people. And that's just too big to do a listing in. Same in urban India. Census data is available, it's just it's not publicly available. So the nice thing about satellite imagery is that you can estimate population based on the image characteristics and kind of use that as a substitute for census data.
As opposed to other traditional methods, because in a lot of countries, as you mentioned, census data is not available. But before exploring these satellite imagery new approaches that we are going to discuss later, people are using a lot of other quasi-random alternatives like the right-hand rule or the spin the pen. And maybe we can talk a bit more about those so that we can maybe compare those with the new alternatives that you have been exploring and see what are the advantages from those. So can you maybe explain what are people using nowadays if they don't have census data for survey sampling?
Yeah, let me talk first about the right-hand rule. And the right-hand rule, I should mention, it does, you still have to do that first step of selecting areas. So you can do that with census data, you can use some other approach, but it's not entirely a substitute. The advantage of the right-hand rule is that it's cheaper. It doesn't do away with the need for census data or some other data to do that first stage of area sampling. So the right-hand rule, it's probably one of the most commonly used household sampling approaches. And I'll kind of describe it, but if people are curious, I think there's an image that we created in the blog post that we'll link, I guess will be linked to, that kind of describes it in more detail. It's a little confusing to just describe it verbally without an image. But basically, the first stage is the same. You select areas. But instead of doing that listing, what you do is you randomly select points. You go to those points, you walk, you follow the road, and you take a right wherever you can. If you hit the end of the road, you turn around, hit the end of the village, you turn around, and you survey every fifth household. That's the basic way the right-hand rule is implemented. There's a lot of different variations, but that's, I think, the most common way. Because the right-hand rule is so popular, this was one of the first things we looked at when we were investigating like potentially cheaper ways. We thought, well, the advantage of the right-hand rule is like a lot of the enumerators that we talk to, that we hire, have experience using this, or we're like, oh, this would be great. If this is rigorous, we can stop here. So we did a lot of testing to figure out whether or not it's a pretty rigorous approach. One of the main things we did was we wanted to test whether it's replicable. And by replicable, I mean like you have two different surveyors start at the same exact point. They end up surveying the same exact households. We did a lot of testing in UP, India, to try to figure out whether or not it's replicable. Each time we would kind of give surveyors, training instructions on how to implement the right-hand rule. they'd go off in completely different directions. We'd come back and be like, okay, we just need to refine the protocol. We need to refine the training. We did that like 3 or 4 times. And then finally we gave up. The challenge with the right-hand rule is there's just too much ambiguity at the like local level to implement it. It's really unclear. I mentioned you follow the road, you take a right where you can. It's a lot of cases really unclear what's a road, what's not a road. And I also mentioned you kind of count all the households on the right-hand side. In a lot of cases, it's unclear whether or not house is on the road, or if it's like 50 meters away, if it's on a different road. Eventually, we just kind of gave up. The training protocol was like 10 pages. We're like, this is not feasible to get it to be replicable. We did a little bit of additional testing as well. To one thing we did was try to estimate the share of households that don't live on a road or don't live within sight of a road. And the way we did this is we did this in the Philippines because we were considering using the right-hand rule in the Philippines, and we used Google Maps, like their automated API for figuring out whether a point is on a road. And we just randomly sampled rooftops from all over the Philippines, tested what share are on a road. We found that like a pretty decent share just live pretty far away from a road. And then we did a little bit of additional testing. The upshot of all this was like we came away thinking it's not an approach that we would recommend as being rigorous. And I think we go a little bit farther and say we don't think it's rigorous at all.
And from there, you started exploring approaches. Maybe you can walk us through the journey until you got to the rooftop sampling that we are going to discuss. So how has it been, that journey of exploring new methodologies for sampling?
I should mention, so we've been constantly on the lookout for alternative approaches to sampling. One of the things we investigated in India was use of voter rolls, because voter rolls are public at the local level in India, and we did a lot of research. My colleagues did a lot of research 3 or 4 years ago to figure out whether or not voter rolls are a good sampling frame. They showed that they are, in fact, pretty, the share of households that have at least one member on voter rolls in rural areas of India is very high. So it's a great and cheap method for rural India. So that was one of the first approaches that we looked at. Unfortunately, that method is not as great for urban India, and we haven't come across another country where voter rolls are public information. So it's pretty much restricted to rural India. That was sort of some of the initial testing we did. After the right-hand rule, we're kind of looking around for other potential ways of doing sampling. And I think one of my colleagues came across this like relatively new data set of building footprints from Google and Microsoft, which is pretty high quality. It's great. It's called the Vita data set or something like that. And we were like, well, can we just like select a rooftop and, and just interview the occupants of that building? And the answer is no, you can't just select one individual building. That building could be commercial. It could be, maybe it's not actually a building. There's some false positives in the data set. If you kind of take a slightly looser approach and say, like, let's select a building, and then let's just go to that, send the surveyors to that point and just interview the 3 or 4 nearest households or something like that, works pretty well. I should also mention we certainly weren't the first to propose this use of this approach to sampling. There's a lot of people who have used very similar techniques, like you drop a random pin and you sample all the households near it. I think the real benefit of the rooftop data is that it allows you to sample households with much better equality of probability. So if you just randomly select a pin in a village and you interview the nearest households, because some households will be densely concentrated in one area, you have a bunch of farmland, households that live in the less dense populated areas have a much higher probability of being selected. With rooftops, you kind of you don't have that problem as much.
Okay, so that's when you started looking into rooftop sampling, which is exactly how you are describing now. Could you maybe share where you have tested this sampling method and what are the lessons learned when using the rooftop sampling?
Yeah, so we've done a lot of testing of rooftop sampling. We did testing in affirmative testing in northern India, some in southern India. We did a pilot in Kenya. We've done some testing in a survey in the Philippines. We've learned a lot through this process. One of the biggest challenges was just making sure surveyors get to the right point. That's tough. I think we figured it out, basically. So one of the things we did is instead of taking the actual rooftop, we just kind of put it on the road. So, if it's less than like 5-10 meters from the road, it's much easier to find a point on a road than to walk around people's backyards. Another thing we did was clarify the instructions on how to find the points and the tech to find the points. The challenge was like we started using like Google Maps, and Google Maps assumes you've arrived at a location if you get within like 30 meters, but we wanted a higher level of precision. So we use slightly different technology. We use Google My Maps, so it stays open and you can kind of get a better sense of whether you're really at the exact point or you're like 20 meters away. So there's a bunch of little stuff that if you kind of dive into our protocol and training materials, took us a long time to develop. But I guess the positive thing about that is that after all that like iteration and testing, we did one final round of kind of like validation testing to test that if you give two surveyors the same point and the same set of instructions, do they go to the same households? In that validation testing, we got 100% accuracy, which is great. It means that at least if you use that protocol and use the training, you should have high replicability.
Which was one of the main challenges that you were discussing about the right-hand rule. Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Now I'm curious in terms of the practical portion of it. So if I was an enumerator and I was following the protocol, the idea was that I would have a mobile device with a direction to a certain point, and on that certain point, I would find the nearest building to get in. Is that more or less how it goes in the field?
Exactly. That's more or less how it goes. So you have a mobile device with a point. You try to get as close to the point as possible, and then it'll also specify a direction. So it'll say like, get to the point, face this direction, look for the nearest house in front of you, and look for the house on the left, the building on the left, building on the right. That's the protocol we've been using that has high replicability.
So there is absolutely an improvement in terms of the bias with the sampling method over the right-hand rule or the spin the pen. Something that we haven't discussed so far is you have also explored a different sampling method, which I believe is the grid-based sampling. How promising was this method compared to rooftop sampling? What were the lessons learned from there?
Yeah, so let me first describe grid-based sampling as we typically use it, and I think most other orgs typically use it. I should also mention, this is something that a lot of other researchers have used for quite a while, so we certainly weren't the first people to propose or use this. But the basic idea behind grid-based sampling is you start from a gridded population data set, like the ones produced by WorldPop or GHSPop. And what these organizations do is they take a map of the world, and for each like sort of 30 by 30 meter square or 100 by 100 meter square, approximately, they create a population estimate for the entire world, which is pretty awesome. So the nice thing about those data sets is, you can directly sample those grids. You don't need any census data. Yeah, you can sample grids or clusters of grids or whatever. We've done grid-based sampling. We thought it was super promising. We did a lot of work kind of building out the tools, the code for managing the data. I think what we found, I think we still think it's a great option if you don't have access to any census data whatsoever or granular census data. But in practice, it is much more expensive and operationally challenging than we originally anticipated. And we're actually just about to publish a blog post on this. I think that the reasons it's challenging are, one, these gridded population maps are good, but they aren't nearly as accurate as even very, very outdated census data. So you just get a rough idea of the population. So in a lot of cases, we were sending surveyors to grids or clusters of grids that we thought had people and ended up being completely empty, or we thought had just a few people and it turned out to have a lot more than we anticipated. So the accuracy of the population estimates is a big challenge. Another big challenge is that doing the household listing in a grid as opposed to like a village is much more operationally challenging. And that's because the boundaries of a grid don't necessarily fall on natural geographic features. You can have like a grid boundary cutting just at the corner of someone's yard or house. And it's really hard for the surveyor to just tell whether that house is in or out of the grid. Or the grid could like cut across a highway or a river, and it's just like, oh, you don't want people walking across like a 5-lane highway or trying to swim across a river. And then just managing the data does take a lot of effort. And specifically the first step of like downloading the data, clustering the grids together, because in a lot of cases, you don't want to sample individual grids. That would be way too small for sampling purposes. You want to cluster them together. The clustering process takes a lot of effort. Our DSEM team has created a lot of great tools to help speed this process, to manage the data, to cluster grids together in good ways. But even with all the tools we've created, we still find it's pretty expensive. It's actually more expensive than that traditional rigorous approach that I talked about.
That's quite interesting. Okay, so maybe moving back to the rooftop sampling, which was quite an interesting and exciting sampling alternative to traditional methods. And keeping in mind that we have listeners all over the world, might be starting a new household project, and they would like to explore more about these sampling methods. What do you think are the skills and the tools required for them to explore this on their end?
So in terms of the tools, we've created we have code along with sort of like instructions on. So we've created a lot of resources for how to do this, which we've made public. In terms of the internal skills that they would need, so there's a first step that's pretty data science intensive, which is you got to find data on subnational administrative boundaries, and you've got to merge that with the rooftop data set. So that is, I think, when we did that, we recently did that for Kenya. If the data is perfectly clean and up to date, it's a pretty straightforward process, but usually it's not. It takes 3 or 4 days of a data scientist's time to accomplish that. And it's just kind of like some annoying edge cases that you're trying to merge. So that's the first step. Then there's, once you have, and that's a one-time step for any country you're working in. Once you've done that, you don't have to do it again in that country for a long time. And then there's kind of a bunch of additional steps. You've got to set up the tech to, I mentioned that the surveyors are given a map with a point. They got to go to that point. Need some engineering/data science time to set up the tech on the surveyor's devices, and manage that process. Again, that's hard. It takes some effort the first time. Once you do it once, it's pretty straightforward. And then, of course, another thing you have to do is train the surveyors on this new protocol. All in all, I do think it is a great option if you're doing a lot of kind of smaller surveys in a country. I will say, if you're like an organization that does like a household survey every once in a while, and you have an existing protocol that works for you, you probably want to stick with that protocol. There is some fixed cost to learning all of this and training surveyors on it.
I think that would be my follow-up question. So when should people actually consider exploring this new method or not? So potentially, if they do conduct a lot of household surveys, and also if they do have this technical capacity, because there is some technical capacity required to that.
Yeah, I would say first, the rooftop sampling and grid-based sampling are both very useful options in different contexts. Rooftop sampling is a great option if you're willing to tolerate a small amount of bias and you want to drive down costs. The appendix of our working paper, we show that it's often a pretty good solution if you have, for a survey smaller than 5,000 households. Once you get above that kind of threshold, it doesn't make sense to do something on the size of a DHS, like a 60,000 household survey, where you're really trying to get estimates that are super precise, but using rooftop sampling where you can have like 1 percentage point bias. That's kind of inefficient use of resources. But for smaller household surveys, it makes a lot of sense. Grid-based sampling, it's really more appropriate if in cases where you don't have access to census data. Both of these options do require some data science and tech. Rooftop sampling, in our experience, is much less of a lift than grid-based sampling, just because the data is easier to manage. And also operationally on the ground, rooftop sampling is easier. Like the listing process for grid-based sampling is pretty tricky. I guess rooftop sampling is a great option for smaller household surveys, but I guess you have to, if you're an organization, you have to look at your pipeline of surveys and make sure you're going to do at least a few of these before you probably want to invest the time and effort into doing all this. Grid-based sampling, I think, it's a good option if you don't have, if you don't have other options available. This is something you can do almost always. It's a big tech investment, but it's usually like, yeah, if you don't have other options, this is a great option. One final thing I'll say about grid-based sampling is, and this is the final point we make in the Cloud Pros, it could be fantastic. We partner with an organization called MapSolve quite a bit in India. They do a lot of GIS tech stuff, and the CEO of MapSolve, was mentioning that using existing data, just slightly different methods, you could significantly increase the accuracy of population maps. And they, their own maps do have much higher accuracy than I think the global ones, because they use like local data and they really like validate the data, and they do a lot of other things. And then the other thing that would make grid-based sampling a lot easier to use is, instead of like having grids, if you have like areas, sub-areas with natural geographic boundaries, that would make it a lot easier to do the listing. So if you had those two things, like better maps, more accurate population estimate maps, instead of like producing at the grid level, producing at a sub-area level, it would be fantastic. It would be far cheaper and easier to use than the standard approach to, and just as rigorous household, the conventional two-stage sampling. So if there's any funders out there who want to fund those two things, that would be fantastic. Especially, in the current context, we've heard a lot about how people with termination of the DHS, we've heard a lot of government agencies, organizations trying to think about like ways of doing surveys cheaper. That would be a fantastic public good if somebody could just invest in that. And it would mean you'd have this option for doing future DHS-like surveys, but with a much cheaper sampling method.
Looking ahead into the future, what do you feel is the most promising future direction for survey sampling methodologies?
Yeah, good question. I'm pretty bullish about this rooftop sampling method. I think as these data sets get more and more accurate, it'll get better and better. If there is some way of figuring out which buildings are residential versus commercial, that would be absolutely fantastic. I'm pretty optimistic about rooftop sampling. I'm also, optimistic about grid-based sampling. Like I said, with some not super large investments, I think it could be absolutely awesome sampling method. The two that I'm super excited about, there's a lot of other kind of sampling methods that we've used for, like you said, there's no one sampling method to rule them all. In this, like every situation, we always like, oh, we got like 3 sampling methods. Let's just choose one of the 3. And then it's like, there's always something tricky. And there's all these like niche sampling methods that we've experimented with that are good in certain situations. One of the things so for example, what a common need when it comes to sampling is to target a subset of the population. So, and a very commonly targeted subset of the population is like pregnant lactating women. And around the world, you often have community health workers who maintain lists of pregnant and lactating women, but these lists are incomplete. If you just use those lists, you tend to exclude the most vulnerable women, and you get extremely biased results. So one of the like niche sampling approaches that we've experimented with is something called dual frame sampling. So the idea is you like use those lists, you sample from the list, but you also do kind of the area sampling approach. You do the area and you list all the women. And surprisingly, if you combine those two approaches, you have something that ends up being cheaper and unbiased. But it's complicated. so it's a good option if you're willing to invest the time in learning the technique and doing all that.
And outside of sampling, because you work a lot into improving data quality, it's not just about sampling. Do you see any trends or new technologies that are exciting to you for the future?
I'm super excited like everybody, about the use of AI for evaluations in general, and specifically for collection and analysis of qualitative data. We're doing a lot with this. We're just using basic off-the-shelf products like Notebook LM to help us analyze data. And it does a fantastic job. It seems like we're not too far away from the situation where some agent will automatically interact with respondents and conduct the interview itself. That seems super promising. No, we'll say we also, while we're super bullish about the use of AI in evaluations in general, we internally think that it's unlikely to replace the role of household surveys. And that's a sort of slightly, we're hearing a lot, especially, there's been a lot of discussions about like, how can we replace DHS data cheaply? And a lot of people are, asking whether AI or maybe alternate sources of information like civil registration and vital statistics databases or health records or other things like that can replace household survey data like the DHS. And from my perspective, unless there's something I'm completely missing, I don't think it's at all feasible to replace the household survey. I think you replace almost everything. Like you could replace me, and probably, a couple of years would be like analyzing the data, all the analysis, all the design, everything in that pipeline could be replaced by AI at some point, but you still have to go and you have to talk to people. There's no other fundamental way of getting that information.
You need human interaction.
You need something to interact, or maybe an agent. Yeah, like if you got to build robots, go to the field and talk to them. I have no idea. I think people are thinking AI is going to replace that step. AI can replace almost everything else, but it can't replace that step.
So one last question before we wrap up is about resources or tools that you want to share with our listeners. We already mentioned the blog post about the right-hand rule and the rooftop sampling, which is something we are going to share. Are there other resources or tools that you want to share?
Oh, that's a good one. So there's a bunch of stuff that we've already published, a bunch of stuff that we're imminently publishing, a bunch of stuff that we hope to publish probably before this podcast is released. So we've already produced a bunch of blog posts in code. So we've got a bunch of, we've got the blog post on the right-hand rule. We're just about to publish a blog post on grid-based sampling and why we think it's good, but it is kind of expensive. We have a lot of code and resources for both of those. For both, if you want to do grid-based sampling, if you want to do rooftop sampling, we've got open source code for both of those.
Anything that you remember, we are going to add that to the description of the podcast episode so that anyone can have access to those resources.
Yeah. And I forgot to mention the academic. We submitted a paper on rooftop sampling. We're happy to share the working paper while it's in the review process. We'll also be submitting a paper on grid-based sampling and the efficiency of grid-based sampling, and also happy to share a working paper version of that as well. One of the reasons I was so excited about this podcast is we were just about to release all this stuff, and we're like, oh, this would be a fantastic venue to release it on.
Perfect. So we are going to share with our listeners all of those ways to get access to the new releases from IDinsight. Thank you so much, Doug. It was great having you here. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This is a delight. Yeah, really, I think this process of talking through it forces you to distill, synthesize all the information, which was a really useful exercise for me.
And we really appreciate it because it's all very useful information. Thank you. Survey and Beyond, the data collection podcast, is brought to you by SurveyCTO. To find out more about SurveyCTO and how it ensures reliable, secure, and scalable data collection, visit www.surveycto.com. And make sure to search for Survey and Beyond, the Data Collection Podcast in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else podcasts are found. Make sure to click subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. On behalf of the team here at SurveyCTO, thanks for listening.